Associating entertainment with performance. This was the first major step that took English drama out of the clutches of that religious mode of drama. Hello everyone, welcome to Nibble Pop. We are doing this series on history of English literature. We have already covered videos on Old English period, Middle English period and Renaissance poetry. The links are given in the description box. Please go and watch those videos too. In this video, I had originally planned to deal with the whole of Renaissance drama, starting from the Tudor age right up to the Jacobean period. But I thought later that if I could divide it up into two parts, it will do justice to the subject. So today in this video, we will be looking at the first part of Renaissance drama. I will begin with some general idea about how drama originated in England and then go on to its development during the Tudor age, during Elizabeth's time especially, and then some idea up to Shakespeare. So we will stop right before Shakespeare, and in the next video we will continue from there. I think that will give you a kind of a proper space and time to register all this information, to assimilate them and use them in your college exams or in your competitive exams. So stay with me till the end of this video because I'm going to give you some very important information regarding the first part of Renaissance drama. This is Monami Mukherjee. Welcome once again. In England, as we have also seen in case of Greece or other European countries, drama originated as an extension of religion, religious services. The churches, they used the mode of drama or the medium of drama to instruct people, to make church service more impressive, to show them that at the end of everything, the good are always rewarded and the evil is punished. So this was the basic structure during the origin of drama, where we see that the intention of a playwright was to impart some moral lesson. I have already discussed with you in the previous videos about the development of miracle plays and mystery plays and how they were connected to church services and the courtyards of the church, and how eventually they started to spread outside the churches. Okay, so if you have watched that video, fine. Otherwise, I just give you a very basic idea here. You see, in England, miracles and mysteries were more or less, interchangeable. Although technically, in France, mystery plays dealt with any play which took its story from the Bible. So that is a mystery play. And miracle plays were specifically based on lives of saints, because in order to become a saint, you needed to perform a miracle. So this distinction was clear in France, although in England sometimes things got a bit blurred. Now, after the development of mystery plays and miracle plays came a phase when this whole idea of drawing material from the Bible or drawing material from religious scriptures, that started to fade out and things were more or less generalized. But here also the basic intention of the dramatists, that was somehow to teach people what is good in life, what your moral ideas should be, how you should spend your life. So that was the idea behind what we now know as the morality plays. So chronologically we can say that morality plays, they evolved later, after miracle plays or mystery plays, but they kind of existed together too. So they were popular, all of them together, towards the end of the Middle English period and the beginning of the Renaissance. So this is the backdrop with which we can start our discussion on how Renaissance drama was diametrically opposite to this whole idea of ethics and morality connected with art and performance and theatre and drama. The first major development which we observe is in the development of interludes. So let me just explain to you what interludes are. Now, towards the end of the 15th century, a more specialized kind of morality plays started to be evolved, which were very much independent of the scriptures, with pronounced realistic and comic elements. So this is something new, you're having comic elements introduced, realism introduced, and these plays were performed in between banquets or royal feasts, and usually they were sponsored by patrons, sometimes the king or the queen, and sometimes noblemen. So they were very short in duration because they had to be performed in between two main courses of the meal somehow, and these were called the interludes. Why they were called the interludes? Because they kind of built a bridge between the early morality plays, the religious drama, and the secular drama, non-religious drama that flourished during the High Renaissance. So this interlude is kind of a bridge in between these two extremes. By the 16th century, the interludes completely dissociated themselves from any ideal of morality or any connection with ethics. So now they were performed simply as pieces of entertainment. Associating entertainment with performance, this was the first major step that took English drama out of the clutches of that religious mode of drama. Toward the end of the 15th century, we have Henry Medwell's play, which is called Fulgens and Lucrece. This was a completely secular play. There was nothing religious about it, and it was taken not from any Bible source or any religious source at all. Parallel to this, we also see some humanist morality play, as in case of John Russell's Interlude to the Nature of the Four Elements. Humanism was essentially a way of looking at the world, keeping human beings at the center instead of keeping God at the center. We know that with the development of science and technology and with these explorations going all around, we have a worldview where human beings are considered to be capable of logical reasoning, and life is not seen as something predetermined by some fate or by some god, but rather a set of human choices. Keep this word in your mind, grafted in your mind, the word choice, because this word, this choice, is what separates Renaissance drama not just from the religious drama which went before it, but also from the Greek or the classical drama. Because in case of Renaissance drama, in case of English Renaissance drama, we see more and more questioning of this concept of choice and the concept of error of judgment, where you make wrong choices and you suffer for it. So your sufferings are not doings of some higher power or some divine mode or some greater force, but it's rather something which you bring upon yourself. So man at the center of the universe does not only mean that man is considered to be very powerful and important. It is also a way of saying that man is more responsible than he was believed to be earlier. With great power comes great responsibility. That kind of a mindset now set in during this phase. Now, because I mentioned John Rastell, I would like to inform you that he was the brother in law of Thomas More. That Thomas More who wrote Utopia in 1516. Now, Utopia was it was a prose work, and Utopia was based on the mindset of exploration and scientific temperament, natural sciences. That was the priority here. Thomas More's Utopia was a very important landmark, and it's also very interesting that this word utopia, which he used in his work, he took that word from the original word which meant nowhere, o topos. But now it is used in the sense of eutopos. Eutopos means good place. So from no place to good place, this is a transition of this word utopia. What More did was he tried to show a world in a satiric mode. He was not actually saying that this was a very good world. He was trying to present through satire a kind of a world which does not exist. And somehow people started to believe that utopia is about a world which is supposed to exist. Now, coming to interludes, it was John Haywood who first popularized this whole thing. And John Haywood, he was a court jester in the court of Queen Mary. He developed this interlude into something which became the first foundation of English comedy. This is how this bridge was built, that eventually we have full-fledged comedies, but John Haywood was the initiator. And being a court jester, a person who is good with witty words, it was easy for him to write these interludes. His interludes, written between 1520 and 1540, they include works like the Four P's. Now, the Four P's stand for pardoner, a palmer, a peddler, and an apothecary. And there was another one which was pretty famous at that time, and that was called The Play of the Weather. Now, since he was a court jester, these plays focused on entertainment and not instruction. Now, don't think that because of the interludes, the morality play, died off completely. Morality plays were performed even during the 16th century, towards the end of the 16th century too, and even later, sometimes mixed with other modes such as tragedies. It was a kind of an evolution that was going on, and things were happening pretty parallelly. It was not like some clear-cut division was seen. The first real play in English with clear-cut divisions of acts and scenes and a regular plot was possibly the comedy Ralph Roister Doister, and it was written by a schoolmaster, Nicholas Udall. Nicholas Udall was heavily influenced by the classical playwright Plautus, who is the writer of Pot of Gold. If you have studied in WBSU first semester, you know about this play, Pot of Gold. That same Plautus, he influenced Nicholas Udall, and therefore we find a combination of classical elements, comic elements, with native ideas. And there is a lot of artificiality because it was the first comedy, of course, and he was experimenting with the form, so it is highly excusable, and it's a very important landmark, Ralph Roister Doister. I would also like to mention another very important piece here, and it was a domestic comedy. It was the first domestic comedy, you can say, and it was called Gammer Gurton's Needle. The authorship of this particular play was pretty uncertain. People used to think that a person called John Still wrote it, but later on it was found out through research that the person who wrote this was William Stevenson. While experimentations were going on in the field of comedy, we have the first tragedy in English, and this was called the Gorboduc. The secondary title was Ferrex and Porrex. Ferrex and Porrex were two sons and of the king, and it was the kind of story which was written later by Shakespeare, in King Lear, the kind of division of property into children and how disputes arise. Gorboduc was also a reflection of the ongoing civil war and the history of the civil war which the country saw. And this was written as a collaboration by two people, Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton. Both Thomas, okay, their surnames are different, Sackville and Norton. They wrote Gorboduc. What is interesting is this is also the first play that was written in blank verse. What is blank verse? Blank verse is when the lines of any drama are poetic but they are not rhymed. So you don't have rhyme at the end of the line. So that is a blank verse. And we have beautiful use of blank verse in Shakespeare, in Marlowe, and of course I have already mentioned in the previous video about John Milton. But in drama, this was Gorboduc, which is the beginning point of blank verse. Now, why was blank verse important? When characters speak in rhymes, especially the main characters, the royal characters, kings and noblemen, they were given lines earlier which rhymed for poetic effect. And common people, uncivilized people, the slaves and the servants, they were allotted prosaic lines to show some difference in class. Now what happened is, when you hear a character speak in rhymes, you find yourself distanced from that character. You don't identify yourself with that character because normal people don't speak in rhymes in real life. Now when blank verse was introduced, what happened, this idea of rhyme was not there, but it still sounded very majestic and poetic, and therefore very important and suitable for the principal characters of a play. And therefore this blank verse helped in that reduction of distancing. People could now, the audience could now feel that okay, the main characters are speaking in a majestic way, but they're at least speaking the language which we speak in. Because during the Renaissance, at least the educated people spoke in a way which was very similar to the blank verse. And therefore, this identification helped in the development of the drama. Now, if you have read Macbeth, just a side question I'm asking you, you'll notice that the witches, they speak in rhymes. So is Shakespeare doing that deliberately to make sure that we feel distant from them? So you see how Shakespeare manipulates these linguistic devices which was at his disposal. So while playwrights like Sackville and Norton reduce the gap between the audience and the characters by introducing blank verse, Shakespeare is doing what? He is deliberately using rhymes for certain characters with whom we don't want to identify. That is the witches, or Macbeth when he is influenced by the witches. And it also offers a kind of a variety at times. Not always evil characters speak in rhymes, not like that. It offers a variety. But no matter what experimentations were done, this almost like 20 years period, the unities were strictly observed. Now, what is the meaning of the word unity? According to Aristotle, or according to the conventions of the classical drama, classical tragedies, 3 unities must be observed or are observed in plays. The unity of time, place and action. That is, a drama should be performed in such a way that the duration of the drama should coincide, if not exactly, but close to the duration of the actual action taking place inside the story. Whatever past or future you want to include in that 2 hours or 3 hours should be done in the way of flashback technique, remembrance, somebody is remembering something and telling, narrating. So that should be the way according to the classical convention. Unity of place means, suppose you're staging a play in a king's court, then the whole action should be there. You shouldn't go on shifting yourself. Even if you shift, it should not be more than a believable distance. You cannot shift between cities and countries. So that is unity of space. And unity of action means any tragedy should be on a single plot. No diversion, no subplots, nothing. It should focus on one single course of action, one single imitation of action. This was the concept of the 3 unities. Now, during this phase, this was strictly adhered to. Seneca was a very important influence of the people who wrote during this time. And there was also a very sharp line between tragedy and comedy. Either you're writing a tragedy or you're writing a comedy. You cannot mix both of them. You remember Sir Philip Sidney, the poet? And he wrote that prose treatise or the essay, The Defense of Poesy. In that, he defended Gorboduc, saying that nowadays everybody is mixing everything up. Everybody is flouting all the rules of unities except Gorboduc. So Gorboduc is praiseworthy. Okay, so this is what Sidney maintains, and he feels that unities should be maintained in order to secure the essence of tragedies or comedies, whatever you are writing. So you should maintain that Aristotelian notion or convention of the 3 unities. Now, with the progress of 16th century, drama became more various, more inclusive, because you see, life is not just about tragedy or comedy. It is about tragedy and comedy. So if you are honest about imitation of action that goes on in life, you cannot ignore the fact that life is just not unitary expression of grief or unitary expression of ludicrousness or laughter. It's a combination. So the more realistic you want to be, the more you have to mix these two apparently distinguished genres. And this was happening towards the end of the 16th century. And this was happening because of the popular demand. People wanted to see these kinds of new forms emerging. And who were producing these plays? Now they were these independent profit-making production houses that were growing up. And their aim was to please the public, to earn money. No moral dimension, no idea of any preaching or religious feelings. Their whole focus was to entertain and satisfy the need of the audience. Just as the present day Bollywood blockbuster directors do. There were some producers of plays who were under the patronage of the royal families or noble families, and in that case sometimes they were biased in presenting some of the ideas, but the independent production houses, they helped in the secularization of drama, because now drama could be performed independent of the churches, independent of even the patrons. And by there was a distance, a rift, a clash created between the city and the stage. Why? Because the authorities or the governing heads of the cities, the mayor, and these other people, they realize that we don't have any control over the content of the plays anymore, because these production houses, they are only catering to the public. So we cannot direct them that you have to show this, you have to show that. So they are doing things independently. And what these production houses did, these companies, they used to set these theaters outside the vicinity of the city. So that is outside the jurisdiction of the mayor. So the mayor cannot go and actually stop a play, and that created a kind of a rift. But people went there, and sometimes there were trouble, in the localities where these theaters were set up, these stages were set up, a lot of gatherings happened, and during that time different kinds of people gathered together, which created a kind of inconvenience for the local people, and they felt that their privacy was intruded upon, and they felt unsafe with so many people around them. So there were these clashes going on, and at the same time the rising Puritan ethos. Remember the Puritan ethos who were against these entertainments and these fanfare, all these glamour elements of life. So these Puritan ethos that was directly opposed to the idea of drama itself and performance, especially performance with entertainment as its motive. So all these different kinds of pulls and pushes were going on. Puritans even said that employees who were in service, they were not paying attention to their work because they had to go and watch a play. So that was the kind of objection they had. But with Queen Elizabeth, what happened? She herself loved entertainment. She was a virgin queen. She didn't marry. But she loved art and performance. And she wanted to make sure that people's needs were satisfied, because she knew that now that her nation was growing, now that she was getting hold of places outside England as colonies, now that wealth was pouring in because of the growing trade and commerce, she knew that people wanted to be entertained. They wanted to somehow spend that wealth. You cannot be a Puritan and a colonial power at the same time, and it was the beginning of the colonial era actually. And therefore, she wanted to become the principal patron of theatre. The Earl of Leicester, he set up the first production company, theatre company, and a man called James Burbage, he was one of Leicester's men. So this man, he set up the first theatre, and it was called The Theatre. It was in 1576. But it was also set outside the city vicinity, so outside the jurisdiction of the mayor and the corporation. Some sources also say that Shakespeare first got job in this particular theatre, and it is also said that much later lumber and timber, that is the wood planks and the raw materials, were taken from this particular theatre to create the Globe Theatre. So after the theatre was set up, several other independent theatres came up, and when I think about the fact that the timber from the first theatre was taken to rebuild, or rather to build the Globe Theatre, I feel that this is also kind of a renaissance, rebirth of the first theatre. So that becomes very nice. And it is also interesting that this Globe Theatre, it got burnt and then again it got rebuilt. So the Globe becomes a symbol of Renaissance itself. It keeps on taking birth and birth and birth and rebirth, as if representing what Renaissance theatre was about, evolving out of its own ashes like a phoenix. Now coming to the structure of these theatres were basically built by people who were originally vagabonds, and they got settled down to do this job and felt that this was kind of a secure income. These theatres were either octagonal, 8-sided, or round, sometimes square, and they were surrounded by gallery with a pit or yard in the middle open to the sky. The stage was kind of a raised platform with outer stage and inner stage, and there was a curtain to divide the two. There was also an upper stage. Very few props were used, minimum props, but costumes were elaborate. And another very important thing is that originally, these scenic backdrops were not much used. Characters used to talk about their backgrounds or their backdrops. So from their dialogue, we would understand whether it is a dark night, whether they're standing in front of a forest, whether they're fighting in a war. So no scenic background was given in the beginning, although in Shakespeare we see that some of these developments start and he uses some scenic backdrops. Another very important thing is that during that phase no women acted in the theatre. So how were women characters portrayed? They were played by young boys, young boys whose voices had not yet cracked, who still sounded feminine and looked feminine, their facial features were feminine. These boys were used as female characters. That was probably another reason the Puritans really felt enraged that how can a man act like a woman? This is like you are going against nature. When we will talk about Shakespeare, we will see how he again destabilizes this whole idea through the concept of cross-dressing and disguises. So that's a different thing. We will talk about it then. What you have to remember is during this phase, women characters were played by young boys. Elizabeth was such a lover of theatre that in around 1583, a theatre company was formed which directly served her. It was like at her royal service. And by we are noticing that this whole genre of drama is getting secularized. It is not religious now at all. This phase was best utilized by a group of men, young men, fresh from the universities, who started to bring in their ideas, and these men are now famous as the university wits. They were young men graduated from Oxford or Cambridge, because these universities were also pretty flourishing at this moment with the revival of learning and everything. They were educated, ambitious, a little disregard for rules, a little rowdy, a bit bohemian. Therefore, these university wits, they brought in a kind of energy, a kind of thinking outside the box because of their learning and because of their youth. Now, who were the prominent university wits? We have John Lilly, Robert Greene, George Peele, Thomas Lodge, Thomas Nash, Thomas Kidd, and Christopher Marlowe. Each of these people, they had their individual style. So it's not like Kidd wrote like Marlowe and Marlowe wrote like Nash, not at all. But they are grouped together because of their educational background, that these were educated people and they were bringing about a change. So we'll look at them one by one. John Lilly, his works appealed more to the children or young adults. He used a lot of mythologies in his works, and his prose was also very stylized, and the basic genre was comedy. So he was more into that. I have also listed some of the plays written by these university wits, so also note them down while I'm speaking. Greene was a real bohemian type, he didn't follow any rules at all, and he didn't follow the rules of comedy even when he was writing comedy, and in not following the rules, he accidentally created what later became the romantic comedy. Again, when we will be studying Shakespeare, we will see what a romantic comedy is and how it is different from conventional comedy. So far as Peele is concerned, he started writing pastoral mythological plays like Lily, but he was not a very gifted dramatist, although he had great style. Lodge, although he is listed with the university wits, and I'm talking about him in a video on drama, he is known more for his prose romance Rosalind, and this Rosalind is the source material for Shakespeare's comedy. Okay, you tell me, which Shakespeare comedy was based on this prose romance Rosalind? Write that down in the comment section. Let me see if you have followed it or not. To give you a tiny little hint, you have the character Rosalind in that Shakespearean play too. So that was based on this prose romance. So far as Nash is concerned, well, I don't think you will ever read anything written by him. Although again, I would ask you to please note down the names of the works by these people. Now let me come to the two most prominent university wits, Kidd and Marlowe. If Greene was the founder of romantic comedy, Kidd came to develop what we now see as the romantic tragedy, or more popularly, the revenge tragedy. What do we see in a revenge tragedy? Of course, we see revenge, and we also see love, conspiracy, murder, a lot of complicated relationships, at times of violence, and violence not just on the level of dialogue but on the level of action. Now this is also something in which Kidd departed bodily from this classical concept of spectacle, because according to Aristotle, as we see in the classical plays, or in case of early English drama, the stage was a place where you cannot show a violent spectacle. But with revenge tragedy, we see a lot of blood and gore and actual stabbing of people on stage, beheading of people on stage. So they bring violence on stage. The most famous work here, and that work is like the epitome of revenge tragedy, and it's called the Spanish Tragedy. It's by Kidd, of course, and he mixes Senecan style with a lot of melodrama. So we have revenge, violence, horror, rhetorical speeches, speed of action, all mixed up. And it took the Renaissance stage by storm. It created a kind of a new era. It's like, the gangs of Wasseypur, which changed the course of Bollywood mainstream movies. So, I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't be comparing this to that, but I have this feeling that the same kind of drastic change was observed, that you bring life to stage and you take away every ounce of ethics and morality. That is Kidd's The Spanish Tragedy. And this became a model for later works like, Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is also a domestic tragedy, because Hamlet's story is also, it's not just a story of revenge, it's also a story of a mother and her son and her husband being killed and she being married to the brother of the husband. So it's actually domestic tussle, and at the same time, it has the majesty of the revenge tragedy. And now finally, we come to the greatest predecessor of Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe. Why am I calling him a predecessor? He was born in the same year as Shakespeare, 1564, and he died in 1593, pretty young. He was son of a shoemaker from a very poor family, and he got educated, and he knew what it meant to be the son of a poor man and what it meant to rise in life. And he valued more than anything else the importance of ambition, intellectual ambition, because this was his childhood and this was the dream of his childhood. And what does he give us on stage? Apart from his poem, Hero and Leander, he was also a poet. He gives us four magnificent plays: Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, The Jew of Malta, and Edward II. These are the four plays for which we remember him. Tamburlaine is the story of Timur the Lame and his ambition, how he conquered such a vast territory, and then how he fell victim to this disease and wanted to win this final battle but could not, because you can fight wars against other humans but you cannot fight your own body. And in this Tamburlaine, which is again like divided into two parts, his early exploits and his later exploits. In Tamburlaine, what we find is called Marlowe's mighty line, that blank verse, that sonorous musical dialogue, which characterized all his major works. Timur Lang or Timur or Tamburlaine, whatever you say, he was from a humble background. The next play, Dr. Faustus, is also about a man who is not from the so-called royal family or anything. He is a man who is pursuing education, learning, higher learning. And he begins the play in a way that Faustus is trying to decide which stream of study he should choose. And he chooses black magic or necromancy. And in doing so, he ends up conjuring the devil, Mephistopheles, and he makes a pact with the devil that he will get 24 years of life, of absolute power and absolute knowledge in exchange for his soul, and he signs that with his blood. After 24 years, his soul is summoned by the devil, and during that moment, Marlowe shows the crisis of Faustus. And this crisis is something which has never been shown on stage. Earlier, plays used to present men who are evil and their punishment pleased the audience, and then men who are good, whose rewards pleased the audience. But now we have this central character whom you observe from the beginning to end, and automatically you get attached to this character. Somehow you begin to even identify traits in yourself with traits in that character, and you feel a kind of a sinister bond with that character. And at the end of the play, the suffering that touches you. So he makes the hero unheroic, anti-hero in a way, anti everything heroic. Starting from the birth of the person, starting from the origin of the person, from the background of the person. And this we also see in case of the Jew of Malta, Barabbas. And Barabbas is a moneylender. He is not presented as a glorious character. There is hardly anything redeemable in him, hardly anything which you like in him. But interestingly, Marlowe does not make him repent even at the end. Faustus shows signs of regret. What Barabbas does, he wants to punish his enemy, burn his enemy in a cauldron, and ends up falling in that cauldron and dies. And while dying, he is blaspheming, he is cursing and saying, oh, why I couldn't do more harm to others. So he is least repentant. I don't know, maybe this was the blaspheming Jew which Macbeth thought about when he was writing those episodes of witches throwing things in the cauldron in the witches scene. Okay, so if you have read Macbeth, you know that the witches were throwing certain ingredients to make some potion for Macbeth, and one of the ingredients was gall of the blasphemous Jew, and probably there was a reflection of this idea of Barabbas or this Jew of Malta. And there is, of course, a direct parallel which you can easily see between Barabbas and Shylock, Shakespeare's Jew in The Merchant of Venice. So these connections somehow keep cropping up in our minds because we have read both. With Edward II, Marlowe exposes the weakness of the king. Now, till now, he was showing, with Tamburlaine, he was showing power and lust for power. With Barabas, he was showing greed. So, he was showing elements in a character which were strong and pronounced. With Edward, he is showing a character who is totally, not powerful at all. And at the same time, who thinks he is very powerful and tries to act what he is not. So, what are the common features of these plays? He is bringing in different kinds of characters, not even from the same locality or from the same country, but what joins them are attributes of ambition, greed, a certain disregard for convention, a certain disregard for what people think of them. And this is probably something which he wanted to celebrate. So I don't know if Milton was Devil's Party or not. Marlowe certainly looks or seems to be so, although we also find elements of morality play in his work, especially in Dr. Foster's, especially the way he ends up repenting, and allegorical characters are even seen there. But this is just a reflection. What he presents to us is that expanse of character, that human beings are capable of so much variety of emotions, so much variety of temperaments, and at the same time they are so very like each other, and they are so very like you and me watching the play. So this identification of the audience with the characters, this continues with Marlowe. Although his characters are so very away from us, he also introduces these women characters, especially Isabella, a very prominent character, the queen of Edward II. Isabella, her relationship with Mortimer, this provides a kind of an additional angle to this whole story. And if you read Edward II and then you read Macbeth, you will see that there is a kind of a parallelism going on here with Lady Macbeth and all. Of course, Lady Macbeth is a far more pronounced character with far more complex development so far as characterization is concerned, but Isabella is unlike any other women character developed so far in English stage or on English stage. He uses exotic place names. This is something which is because of the colonial expansion of England. English people were getting acquainted with all these places all around the world, and they came to know about these different cultures, these different ways of experiencing the world, that this world is not what the Bible tells you. This world is beyond the reach of any one single religion or any one single text. With Edward II, he also begins what we see as the historical play or chronicle play, and this gets perfected in the hands of Shakespeare. So in Marlowe, we see there is this obsession with power, this intoxication with power, and human agency. That you are a human being, you have the right to destroy yourself. He does not pass a moral judgment on that. And if you destroy yourself, you will have to face the consequence. So it's not like human beings are given unrestricted freedom of choice. They are given freedom of choice with the condition that they have to accept the consequence, be responsible for it. In characters like Edward II, we hardly see any recognition of his errors. He doesn't even realize why he is suffering. He says that, why am I overruled? I am a king. But in Mortimer, that is a apparently non-principal character, but who I feel is more powerful as a character, he knows when he dies that he is reaching the point where the wheel of fortune is turning and he has reached the point at the top of the wheel and now he has to only go down. So this is a realization, an anagnosis of a sort. When Marlowe was writing, he was so much under the influence of Machiavelli. Machiavelli, in his works in general, his idea was that power is not related to morality. It's related to your choices, and a ruler should have power and should have the knowledge to use that power, irrespective of morality. So dissociating morality from power, that is Machiavelli. And in Edward, in case of Tamburlaine, we see the reflection of this Machiavellian man. And at the same time, we have Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is also giving a kind of a same worldview. So Renaissance ambition and virtue and lust for power, and at the same time experiencing this brave new world, everything comes together in Christopher Marlowe. The English people were taking risks when they were going on voyages. They were taking risks when they were experimenting with technology. They were taking risks. But Marlowe's plays explore the boundaries of the new world and the risks mankind was ready to take for quest of power, for knowledge, for love. So he wanted to test the limits, how far man can go, how far can he choose, how much can he fall and how much can he rise. The dying words of Mortimer, the dying words of Faustus, they show how transient man's life is. You know, what Macbeth tells us in Shakespeare's immortal play, how full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. What a stage was set before the magician playwright William Shakespeare cast his spell on the world theatre. What a backdrop indeed. What bugs me is that why couldn't Shakespeare write a single successful play? He wrote some of his plays while Marlowe was alive, but none of his plays were successful before the death of Marlowe. These two playwrights were born in the same year, and Shakespeare became popular only after Marlowe had died or was assumed to be dead. I'll leave you with this disturbing thought and hope to see you next week with the second part of the Renaissance drama, where in understanding Shakespeare, we will have some closure to these developments, especially the developments initiated by Christopher Marlowe, and how the post-Shakespearean era, the era of Ben Jonson and comedy of humors, that era eventually faced that abrupt end with the closing of the theatres. So, see you all in my next video. Hope you all stay very safe. If you have exams during this time, all the very best to you. Thank you for being a part of our journey. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye bye.